Is this working? Okay, I'm just going to wait. We're not quite at 2 yet, or a 1 yet. Thank you. Yep. Do you guys like the lights on better? You know, it's better if the lights are on because I can see whether you're going to sleep or not. Is it too bright? Oh, that now it's perfect? Yeah. You see? Dawa, thank you for the light. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is 2 o'clock. First of all, for those of you who observed, here I was trying to move it forward. But you see, this is the way we find out whether you're asleep, whether you're paying attention. Okay. I want to wish everybody a happy new year, those of you who observed the new year. And I want to remind you right off the bat that next week is Yom Kippur, and there will be no class next week. The Fromm is shut on Yom Kippur. That is the tradition here. Just wanted you to be aware of that. Number two, you all received the Edward R. Murrow Winston Churchill piece online, right? Everybody got it? Okay. I don't care when you listen to it, but I want you to listen to it. And then I want you to be aware that you also get a recording of my lecture. Now, I know it's a tough choice to make between Winston Churchill and John Rothmann, but several people remarked that accidentally they erased my lecture. I was appalled. If you do make that mistake, just call the office and harass them. They will make sure that it's back for you. I want, first of all, well, we've got a few people coming in. Let me just let them get seated. I want to remind you that we left off last week with the armistice, and that on November the 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. Winston Churchill was still an active participant in everything, but I want to pause just for a moment to back up a little bit to tell you about Churchill's strength and power. One of the reasons why I wanted you to listen to the Edward R. Murrow piece was because of his ability to speak. You all understand that Winston Churchill had a stutter. He couldn't pronounce S's. And so for him to be able to speak, he had to overcome great obstacles. It's really an inspiration. And some of you may recall when there were ads in magazines about the society that helps people who stutter, they used Winston Churchill and his story as the basis for encouragement. In 1897, Winston Churchill wrote an essay. The essay is not included in his collected works, but you can go online to read the whole essay. It is called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. And because Churchill made a living with his tongue and his pen, as I reported to you last week, I want to spend just a moment, because when we get into the 1930s and we get into the 1940s and we get into the 1950s, Churchill's use of language was what changed the world. He mobilized the English language and put it into battle. And there are many who would say, without Churchill's rhetoric, the course of British history would have been profoundly different. This is what Churchill wrote in his essay, The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. Of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is so precious as the gift of oratory. He who enjoys it wields a power more durable than that of a great king. He is an independent force in the world, abandoned by his party. And let me remind you, Winston Churchill was abandoned on several occasions by his party. Abandoned by his party, betrayed by his friends. Same thing again, poor Winston Churchill. Stripped of his offices, again, Churchill is referring to himself. Whoever can command the power is still formidable. Many have watched its effect. And I want you to understand why he believed this. He said that in order to have this power of oratory, there were certain key things that you had to have. One, correctness of diction. Stop and think about it. It's easier when you listen to somebody speaking if their diction is clear, when they don't slur words. Or as I like to point out to people, people say, what's the thing that disturbs you the most? When somebody says like. I count among my children's friends. It's so disturbing. So correctness of diction. Number two is rhythm. And when you listen to the Murrow recording with Churchill, you hear the rhythm of his speech. Number three, accumulation of argument. I'm an old debater, and I can tell you that when you begin your argument and you point in a particular direction, then all of a sudden it flows. It comes to a logical conclusion. Have you ever listened to a speaker who's scattered, who can't quite make up which direction they're going in? And of course you lose it. And next, of course, is the analogy. The idea of being able to draw an analogy. And all of you do that, right? When you're speaking and you think about something that relates to. And I have to tell you, when you read this essay, which I'm not going to read to you, you will understand it. He also suggests something else, the extravagance of language. And this is what he said. The effect of such extravagances on a political struggle is tremendous. They become the watchwords of parties and the creeds of nationalities. But upon the audience, the effect is to reduce pressure, as when a safety valve is opened. So it's very important to consider the fact that you really want to make sure that there is a methodology to what you are doing. This, to me, is very important. There is another essence here, which I think is interesting, and he talks about it using an example, and that is the Earl of Chatham's speech on the excise tax. You all know that speech, right? Remember it well? This is what he said. And I want you to listen to it carefully because it's really important. And as I'm saying it, you should be able to picture in your mind. The poorest man may in his cottage bid defiance of all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storms may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his forces dare not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement. You could picture it all, couldn't you? And that, to me, is what is so compelling. He used another example of William Jennings Bryan, who in 1896 captured the Democratic nomination for president at the age of 36 years of age by using a very simple method. Standing before this convention with a voice that could be heard from one end to the other, he said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The impact of oratory is very important. And Winston Churchill's basic argument is so critical to understand his own evolution. And it was more than that. It was the fact that he used his oratory, and you know, he was a prolific writer. We're going to talk about his occupation as a writer. But you know how he did it? He sat in a bathtub filled with bubbles. He had a cigar in one hand and a brandy in the other hand. And he had a secretary, and he dictated. That's all he did. He dictated. He didn't write it down, although in his mind, as I try to do in my mind, I'm going to try to follow that example. There is an outline in my mind of what I'm going to do. And so Churchill, who always had a problem with money, he never was able to do what he wanted to do because although people assumed he was from a wealthy family, well, he wasn't. And then he had a peculiar moment because sometimes, oh, is that for me? Sometimes he was in office and sometimes out of office. And what I'd like to do for just a few moments is explain to you, God, everybody wants me. Yeah, we have to turn off the phones. Although when they're on, we can all chime in. I guess I should not give up my day job to become a comedian. We left off with Churchill, with the armistice being signed. The war ended, and he became Secretary of State for War and Minister of Air. Now, please understand that Churchill insisted on learning how to fly very early on. At the beginning of the First World War, he would get in a plane and fly, much to the horror of everybody. But there was more. And here I want to get to a very serious subject, which is impacted in the news today. On the 15th of February, 1921, the war is over. He is still a member of Parliament. He hasn't lost his seat yet. We're getting to that. He became the Colonial Secretary and began negotiating settlements in both Ireland and the Middle East. Now, remember that I suggested to you that Churchill was the ultimate imperialist? He was. But he viewed imperialism as a positive force. And that, to me, is what is clear. Colonialism and imperialism to him were not negatives. By colonizing, you brought civilization. It was a very important point. So in the Middle East, there were huge conflicts. And I address this with you now because we can see even today on the news, right here in the Bay Area, and we'll talk about Benjamin Netanyahu in a moment, the impact of Churchill and his diplomacy. On the 2nd of November, 1917, Churchill is then at war, but is still being consulted about everything. The British government issued something called the Balfour Declaration. Now, those of you who've taken my course on the Middle East, which I've taught a number of times here, I think they even have the recordings of it. One of the things I dwell on is the fact that the Balfour Declaration was rejected by the Arabs overwhelmingly because they said, by what right does Britain, which has no role in the Middle East, at that point they hadn't even won the war, give something that isn't theirs to somebody else? I mean, it makes perfect sense. When I do my course on the Middle East and I present the Palestinian perspective, I emphasize this because the injustice, as it is perceived, is still felt. The letter was addressed to Lord Rothschild, and let me share it with you. It's very short. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. So you understand, this declaration by the British cabinet is issued with the approval of the British cabinet, And this is what it says. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. It's very simple. It's very direct. It's very clear. I should be gratified if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation, and it's signed Arthur Balfour. Okay. For some people, this was amazing, but it's a great example of British imperialism. What was the British motivation? They believed that if they supported a Jewish state in Palestine, this is 1917, Jews around the world, who overwhelmingly favored the creation of such a state, would then jump on board. They would support the British effort against who controlled Palestine in those days? The Ottoman Turks. So if you had a choice and you were a Jew between supporting the Ottoman Turks who wanted to maintain the Ottoman Empire or supporting an independent Jewish entity in Palestine, it made perfect sense. And this, to me, is what is so critical, because it becomes pivotal. By the way, somebody asked me coming in, when are we going to talk about India? We're going to talk about India in 2 weeks, because that's the 1930s. And you can't discuss British imperialism without India. But wait. Please do not view imperialism in a negative way. It can be negative. In the American experience, what did we do when we expanded across the continent at the expense of the indigenous population? It was a classic case of imperialism. On March the 12th, 1937, so we're leaping ahead, Winston Churchill testified before the commission, the Peel Commission, which was investigating the situation in the Middle East, as the author of the 1922 British White Paper. Let me explain about the British White Paper. It had declared that Jews were in Palestine as a matter of right, not by sufferance. Churchill told the commission that the Balfour Declaration commitment to the Jews had been important when at war, and it made clear that it was a commitment that Britain was making over the years ahead. But it's not just Palestine. The British, that is Winston Churchill, created a country called Iraq. They created Iraq. Iraq was not an independent kingdom. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And Churchill had another problem. The force in the First World War, if you watch Lawrence of Arabia, remember that's the movie you have to see where there are no women? Not a woman. The British aligned themselves with a family, the Hashemite family. And the Hashemite family helped to create what was called the Great Arab Revolt. It wasn't great. It was rather small. It wasn't even particularly significant. But the British, particularly Churchill, felt beholden to that family, the Hashemite family. Now wait. They had princes. And if you're an imperialist, where do you want and how do you want to reward people? Very simple. They put Faisal on the throne of a new kingdom called Iraq. He was from the Arabian Peninsula, for God's sake. And with Palestine, the British, and this is Winston Churchill, drew a line on the map at the Jordan River and created something called Transjordan. That is to say, the other side of the Jordan. And you needed a king there, didn't you? But wait, we don't want to make them an independent kingdom yet because we want to control them. So they created the Emirate of Jordan, of Transjordan, which ultimately evolves in 1946 to become the independent kingdom of Jordan. And who do they install as the emir? They don't want to call him a king yet. Who do they install as the emir? A man by the name of Abdullah. And by the way, if it sounds familiar, it's his great-grandson, Abdullah II, who is now the ruler of Jordan. So Winston Churchill, as British Colonial Secretary, redraws the map of the Middle East. He is the one who makes these defining moments. When Churchill testified before the Peel Commission, he was very clear. I insist upon loyalty and upon the good faith of England to the Jews, to which I attach the most enormous importance, because we gained great advantage in the World War. Do you understand? They didn't do it out of benevolence. They did it out of self-interest. He went on to say, we did not adopt Zionism entirely out of altruistic love of starting a Zionist colony. Oh, wait, let's pause for a moment. Do you understand the creation of a colony? Wait, we were called the colonies, weren't we? There were 13 colonies in the United States before it was the United States. Colonies was not a pejorative word in those days. It went right along with imperialism. And Churchill went on to say, it was the great importance to our country. It was a potent factor in public opinion in America, and we bound by honor, and I think upon the merits, to push the thing as far as we can. This was in 1937, on the eve of World War II. Churchill testified that the Balfour Declaration envisioned, and I quote, an increasing Jewish population, and that population should not in any way be restricted from reaching the majority position. Okay, that's imperialism. There it is. The British had a goal to insert into the Middle East a colony that was Western in its approach, democratic in its approach, and which would be sympathetic to the British Empire. He went on to say, there might be a great Jewish state there, numbering millions. And he's right. That's what happened. Churchill concluded that this is 1937, okay? So it's the eve of World War II. Neville Chamberlain is prime minister. The British are not at that point sympathetic in policy to the Jews in Palestine. And so he says, Churchill concluded that Britain was bound to uphold its commitment under the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate, not only because it was right, but because if Britain did not, another great power would take over the area of strategic importance. And what was he talking about? Germany and Italy. Remember the Mufti of Jerusalem, about whom I wrote a book, and I've talked about it here. The Mufti of Jerusalem was an ally of Germany, and Hitler's commitment to the Mufti was, when we win the war, we'll eliminate the Jews, and it will be yours. And by eliminate, he meant exterminate. And this is what Churchill said. He said, my view is that you should go on and preserve this task, holding the balance in accordance with the Declaration, allowing the influx of new immigrants, that is Jews, to take place as fast as can be. This is 1937. Hitler is on the rise. America has shut its doors. Britain wasn't opening its doors. Churchill concluded, but if you cannot do that, give it up then, and let Mussolini take it, which he may very well be anxious to do. someone else might come in. You might have to face that. A power like Italy would have no trouble. There are powers in the world which are rising powers that are amoral powers. Hitler is who he was talking about. It is very important to understand that Churchill declared himself early to be a Zionist. Now, I talked about Benjamin Netanyahu, who is here in San Francisco, even as I'm speaking to you now. In fact, if I were not here, I would be down at Union Square, where many Israelis are gathered to protest the current judicial reform in Israel. This is the first rally I've missed, because I, of course, would not dream of missing a class at the Fromm. When he wrote his book, A Place Among the Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote this: Churchill was a firm believer that the Jews could build their home in Palestine while benefiting the Arab residents. He told Arabs who petitioned him to keep the Jews from buying land in Palestine and settling there, no one has harmed you. The Jews have a far more difficult task than you. You only have to enjoy your own possessions, but they have to create out of the wilderness, out of the barren places, a livelihood for the people they bring in. He was attacked in the House of Commons for granting the Jews concessions for hydroelectric protections in the Jordan River. And he said this, well, he said it many times. He said, I'm a Zionist. He believed it to the end of his days. Now, again, I want to frame this very carefully. What Churchill framed as something positive was in fact viewed by many as negative. That colonialism and imperialism, which can be presented, I almost debated myself on the question, going from one side to the other, because I think it's really important to understand that there were benefits and there were reasons not to. Churchill made it clear. And while he's doing all of this, he's dealing with India. But I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait on India. I want to wait until not next week when we're not here, but the week after, because that I can frame subject to his opposition to Hitler, which we all cheer in retrospect. But when it came to India, the same time, people were furious at him because he was demonstrating classic imperialism. It was also at this time that Churchill discovered something else: painting. He was deeply depressed by what had happened at Gallipoli. He was to lose his seat in Parliament in the election of 1922. And Churchill was very depressed. You can hardly blame him. And in order to cure his depression, he was told, why don't you try painting? And that's what he did. Interestingly enough, his paintings are really quite good. There was an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. When I was 10 years old and I went to London, they were having an exhibit of Churchill's paintings in London at the National Gallery. I, being 10 years old and very naive, thought Churchill would most certainly be there. How could he not be there? He lost his seat in Parliament. And let's describe that for a moment, because I think it's really important. The year was 1922, and Churchill was a child of Parliament. He loved being in Parliament. And when he lost his seat, he lost something else. His mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, died on the 29th of June, 1921. And then something else happened, something so dreadful that Churchill never recovered. His daughter Marigold died on August 23rd, 1921. She was a child, the light of his life. and it was devastating. She was 3 years old. So when you stop and you think, anyone here, God forbid, who has lost a child, on top of everything else, he loses his seat in Parliament, he loses his mother, he loses a daughter. It's devastating. Churchill was plagued by something that he called his black dog. It was depression. And he was always looking for a way of getting around it. Now, let me talk about Churchill as a writer for a moment, because as I said, he made a living by writing articles, books, epic books. The biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, multi-volume. His history of the Great War, multi-volume. He wrote about everything. And because he was as masterful with a speech as he was with a printed word, he made money. And he sold rights to his books. And one of the great things about Churchill is, in those days, there were newspapers and magazines who paid money for you to write an article. And if the name Winston S. Churchill appeared, well, people got very excited. For Churchill, his 2 years out of Parliament were important, but then he did something else. Now, some of you have been to England and you've seen the War Room. The question is, did you go to Chartwell? Churchill's country home at Chartwell, which he purchased in November of 1922. This, again, was part of his effort to recover, to come back. And Chartwell became his sanctuary. By the way, if you go to Chartwell, you will see a brick wall that Churchill constructed. He did it with painstaking care. It became an expression of his art. In other words, the creativity in Churchill manifested itself not only with a paintbrush, it manifested itself in building things. Chartwell became his retreat. And the interesting thing is, he didn't tell his wife in advance that he was going to buy it. Now, I want you to think about a man who is financially strapped, who, without consulting his wife, buys an enormous piece of property, which has to be maintained. Now, wait, oh, no, you have to understand this. Churchill lived an extravagant life. The best food, the best liquor, the best clubs, the best travel. Everything had to be the best, first class, which meant he had to be able to support his lifestyle. And ladies and gentlemen, he could not support his lifestyle. And we're going to talk more about that, but I want to just indicate to you, he became very friendly with Bernard Baruch. Many of you will remember Bernard Baruch in his old age, sitting on the bench in Central Park, dispensing great wisdom. But Bernard Baruch was more than that. He was Churchill's financial advisor. And because you all remember the 1920s, the years of boom, Winston Churchill made massive profits. Massive. And because we're dealing with the 1920s, you must understand, he came to the United States to speak on numerous occasions. For Churchill, the most devastating moment was when the stock market crashed. How could he afford to maintain his lifestyle? He was overextended in every way. And members of Parliament, he was back in Parliament because you all, I've got to throw this in too. He was defeated in 1922 rather, in October. And then he made the decision to run again for Parliament, which he did. And in 1924, on November the 7th, he was not only reelected, but he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This was in Stanley Baldwin's government. But it's interesting to note, his father had the same job. And when he was offered the job of Chancellor, they didn't say Chancellor of the Exchequer. He thought he was going to be Chancellor of some little duchy somewhere. And then it occurred to him, no, I'm going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer. By the way, he was a complete abysmal failure as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He couldn't even balance his own books, let alone the country's. Churchill's strength was his resilience and his ability to put together a group of people around him who would make all the difference in the world. And I want to spend a moment on this because I think we think of Churchill as a force of nature, which he was. But Churchill also had the ability to attract people. And when we get to the 1930s, which we will in 2 weeks, I'm going to describe to you in some detail the kind of people he had around him, which enabled him to do what he needed to do. Winston Churchill's phenomenal growth and development had to do with that. Now, I want also to talk about Churchill's relationship with America. The man who was his mentor, it's okay. The man who was his mentor was also his mother was his mistress. Does anybody here know the name Burke Cochran? Okay. Burke Cochran was a New Yorker. He was an Irish politician. He was very close to Al Smith. And Burke Cochran was a natural gifted orator. When Lord Randolph died and Lady Churchill struck up a relationship with Burke Cochran, it became essential for Churchill because Burke Cochran explained to him the power of oratory and made sure that when Churchill came to the United States, he had the ability to speak. And let me just tell you, Burke Cochran was the one who nominated Al Smith for president in 1920, in 1924, and then he died in 1922. So the question was, who would nominate Al Smith for president in 1928? Al Smith was an Irish Catholic. Burke Cochran was an Irish Catholic. But political balance, this is something Churchill learned here in the United States. Who was the most prominent Protestant, famous name in the country at the time? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been stricken with polio. And I've told the story, but I want you to understand how important this was. Roosevelt was plotting a political comeback. But would you vote for somebody who was a cripple? I'm using that harsh term. And the death of Burke Cochran, they had to find somebody else. And Al Smith came to Franklin Roosevelt, who was a cripple. He could not stand on his own 2 feet. And one day, Al Smith came to Roosevelt's home. Now understand, Roosevelt was seated in a chair because he couldn't get up and walk around. And Al Smith liked to pace. And that drove Franklin Roosevelt nuts because he couldn't stand up and do the same thing. Very similar to Churchill's temperament. Roosevelt needed an escape, and politics became his escape. And he had an assistant, a little gnome of a man called Lewis McHenry Howe. Now, Roosevelt and Howe knew exactly why Smith was coming to see Roosevelt. They plotted it out. And F.D.R. came in, pacing around, driving Al Smith nuts. And finally, Al Smith looks at Franklin Roosevelt and says, "Frank, he called him Frank, which drove Roosevelt crazy. Frank, Bert Cochran is dead. I need somebody to nominate me at the Democratic Convention in Houston. Remember, F.D.R. had been the Democratic candidate for Vice President of the United States in 1920. And Roosevelt still had a national reputation. And so it was a very simple prospect. Roosevelt, listening to Smith, and Smith says, Frank, how would you like to nominate me at the convention? And Roosevelt says, why, Al, what a surprise. And then, of course, Roosevelt agrees. But there's a question that Al Smith has. Frank, given the fact that you're a cripple, can you get up and walk? And Roosevelt told a whopper, oh, Al, I practice walking every day. And so the deal was done. And let me tell you, Franklin Roosevelt strapped on his braces and he walked. It wasn't really walking, you understand. It was maneuvering his hips from side to side. And Franklin Roosevelt's eldest son, Jimmy Roosevelt, was a close friend of mine. Jimmy and I talked together, worked together on a lot of different things. And he described how every day he would sit with his father, the braces would be put on, Jimmy would stand next to his father, and his father would take his arm. And let me explain to you, Jimmy said to me, it's all right, don't worry. You know, it's interesting. If you told me to turn off my phone, I wouldn't know how. So I'm always very, okay, I'm glad. Jimmy Roosevelt described me, his father, holding his arm so tightly that his arm was bruised. And on the day of the convention, all Roosevelt had to do was to walk 10 paces. And let me tell you, the whole convention remembers Bert Cochran. They remember Bert Cochran commanding the entire stadium simply by his presence. Could Roosevelt do the same thing? And of course, you know what happened. 1924 at the convention. Roosevelt, it was a problem. How do you get him in? Roosevelt instructed them to build ramps out of view so that he could be wheeled up the ramp to the convention platform. And then when the time came, Roosevelt was very nervous about falling. He said to a very heavy man who was the convention manager, go up to the podium and shake it as hard as you can, because you know what would have happened if Roosevelt had gotten up and fallen. His career would have been over, and Al Smith would have been history. Well, when the time came, Roosevelt was introduced. There was not a sound in the convention hall. Everyone was waiting to see whether he would fall. And slowly, methodically, pretending to walk, Roosevelt came to the podium, held it on both sides, put his head back, and smiled and waved. And the whole convention went nuts. And Roosevelt delivered the speech that brought him back politically. The happy warrior, Alfred E. Smith. Where did Roosevelt get the inspiration to do this? From Bert Cochran. This man who is forgotten in history, but who was an inspiration. You know, when Churchill would come on speaking tours in the 1930s, he would say to people, did you ever hear Bert Cochran? And most people had no idea who he was talking about. Churchill was inspired by an American orator, not by a British orator. And may I tell you, Franklin Roosevelt learned the same lesson, that if you could master words, you could achieve great things. So when we get to the 1940s, and we talk about the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill, and by the way, I have a 3-volume set of their correspondence, which is fascinating to read, you understand the symbiotic relationship based on the scaffolding of rhetoric, the power of oratory, and overcoming disaster. For Roosevelt, it was polio. For Churchill, it was the loss of his mother and his daughter and his seat in Parliament all at one time. This, my friends, is the 1920s. The greatness of Roosevelt and the greatness of Churchill were forged on the tragedy of personal defeat and personal tragedy which had to be overcome. I want to remind you, Roosevelt had been defeated for vice president in 1920, that Churchill was defeated for parliament in 1922, that he then came back and was able to make a difference. What is the lesson? The lesson is that when you are stuck in the valley of despair, when you think everything has gone wrong, you can recover. And on top of that, just so you're all clear, the overcoming of personal tragedy is what is most difficult. Now, I'm told I have to give you a 10-minute break. So take 10 minutes, take a stretch, and we'll come back. Yes. Because Churchill wasn't involved.
Did Churchill switch parties in the 20s?
Roosevelt, no.
No, Churchill.
Yes, yes. He came back to the conservatives. I'll get to it, yes.
Yeah. And it's almost like Nixon in a way, that after the defeat in 62, they thought he was done. Didn't go on to greatness, but he did.
Yes, he did. No, he went on to greatness, if you consider it, yes.
I got a question.
Yes.
Borrow money to do their finance.
You asked me in front of the class. We'll get to it.
Is that one of the reasons he wanted to choose an out in Israel?
No, he needs, well, I'll answer in front of the class. I promise. You're not kidding. Unbelievable. Good. Thank you for telling me. stumble myself. No, you never interrupt. No, it's my pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. I'm shorting it up. I have too much to cover. All right, if you'll take your seats. Is everybody out of the hall? Good. Now, let me explain to you, one of the great things about this class is there's so many questions. And if I told you how many people have posed great questions, which would require another 2 or 3 hours. But one of the questions that I want to answer right away is about Bert Cochran. Bert Cochran, Churchill wrote in 1932, in the 1930s, in pithy rotundity, in antithesis and incomprehension, Burke's conversations exceeded anything I have ever heard. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, when you reflect on the fact that here we all admire Churchill, and if Churchill were sitting here, he would say, study Bert Cochran. Because we copy, don't we? We do. You all use examples. Cochran was a tall, commanding figure with large, deep-set eyes that flashed imperialistly. He captivated Winston's mother, and they met in Paris shortly after the death of Lord Randolph. While their affair in the spring of 1995 was in progress, Winston joined the military, went to Cuba. We described all that last week. Cochran was a widower at the time. He was 41 years old, and what I omitted because I wanted to throw it in now, he was a Democratic member of Congress. He was part of Tammany Hall. So here he is, an Irish immigrant. He can't be president, but he is able to influence by virtue of his oratory. And I want to underline this 1,000 times. That's why I want you to listen to the Edward R. Murrow recording of Churchill's great speeches. Churchill modeled himself after Cochran. Cochran met Winston Churchill's boat when he came to the United States, whisked him off to a dinner party, and then to a New York bar. The next day, Cochran took Churchill to a celebrated murder trial then in progress. Cochran, a famous trial lawyer himself, gave this advice on forensic technique. To present a case, you have to pick the strongest argument on your side and concentrate on that. Build and mount an indisputable conclusion. Well, that's what a good debater does, right? You build an argument on an indisputable point of fact. And that was what Churchill did. In 1957, Adlai Stevenson, who had twice run for president of the United States, had never heard of Bert Cochran. Churchill was astonished. And he told Stevenson, which Stevenson described, about his debt to Bert Cochran. The same year, Winston's cousin, the author in Washington that Cochran's advice inspired much of Churchill's early ideas in oratory. This is Churchill's own family testifying to that. So I do want you to understand that although Churchill was a genius, he also had great luck. And I want to give you another example. I told you last week that Churchill was a lousy student. And in order to get into Sandhurst, you had to take a geography test, but you didn't know what the test was going to be. And Churchill was terrified because his grades were not particularly good. And so, on a random whim, Churchill chose New Zealand. And he memorized everything about New Zealand. And guess what? No, that was the question, to describe the geography of New Zealand. Remember, this was a period of British imperialism. It made perfect sense. But Churchill later reflected, had he not had the good fortune to choose the right country, he never would have gotten into Sandhurst. And I have to confess to you, my belief, I have a wonderful book, which is a biography of Bert Cockburn, that had he not become entranced by Cockburn, simply because of Cockburn's affair with his own mother, he would never have been what he became. Now, the 1920s is a very difficult time for Churchill. He's back in Parliament. He comes to the United States, and the Great Depression hits. He's here in the United States when the Great Depression strikes, and he lost everything. And when I tell you he lost everything, I mean he was completely wiped out. So what did Churchill do? He signed up for more books. He wrote a book called Great Contemporaries. He wrote more history. He wrote magazine articles. One of my favorites is in a book called The Ifs of History. He wrote an essay, What if the South had won the Battle of Gettysburg? I have to tell you, I was a kid when I first read it. I was riveted by his grasp of history. And so as the 20s conclude, Churchill is back. I mean, he's back to a degree. He's back in the Parliament, which is what he wanted. He is a man who is already beginning to think about implications. Now, I left something out that I want to include, and then I want to go to your questions, because so many of you asked me good questions. But I want to talk for a minute about Churchill's relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union. If I didn't, I would be remiss. Churchill was an imperialist from his point of view. So when the Russian Revolution takes place in 1919, 1920, are you all aware that the White Russians, the Tsarist forces, battled the Red Russians? And it was a war. And Churchill advocated giving everything that Britain could give to defeat communism. He wanted, in his own words, Bolshevism to be strangled before it would infect the world. And Churchill regretted that his advice failed, but at the same time, he understood the consequences of the rising tide in the 1920s of not only communism, but also of fascism. Leave Nazism aside for a moment. The rise of Mussolini was terrifying. And when Churchill talked about the Middle East, it wasn't that he wasn't thinking about the rise of Germany, but Germany was still devastated. But he was thinking about the fact that Churchill understood that Mussolini wanted colonies. Albania, remember? And do you also remember Libya? And so when the Second World War breaks out, Churchill understands completely what Mussolini's vision is. And he knew it had to be fought vigorously. Why? Because the rise of another great power would impinge upon Britain's imperial designs. Does that make sense to you? It's point counterpoint. Nixon and Kissinger used the same concept in recognizing China. They needed to have a counterbalance to Russia. Right now, what's going on in the Middle East? Why are there all these overtures to Saudi Arabia? Well, they may be barbarians, but they're our barbarians. And who counters the Iranians? And I want, again, to be crystal clear about this. Although it's leaping forward, it helps to put this in perspective. Churchill is reelected as prime minister in 1952. One of the first things that he does with John Foster Dulles, remember what Churchill said about Dulles? He's like a bull who carries with him his own china shop. Britain is an island. Remember, we talked about that last week, and Japan the same way. What did Britain need? It needed oil. And there was a company called British Petroleum. Now, I mention this today rather than later for a reason. We today concluded a deal with Iran. All of you are aware, the transfer of $6 billion in accumulated wealth that we've been holding since the Iranian Revolution. In return, the hostages are released. A lot of people condemn it. It was not our money, it was their money. We were holding it. We got what we wanted, I think. But there was a company called British Petroleum, BP. And there was a man who rose to power in Iran whose name was Mossadegh, who was a popular figure and became prime minister. When Mossadegh talked about nationalizing the oil, it would have meant that BP, British Petroleum, would have lost that concession. And more than that, what fueled the British fleet? Petroleum. And a lot of it came from Iran. And so we conspired to overthrow a regime. Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was assigned the task of supporting the Shah and overthrowing Mossadegh. And the Shah was restored to power, and Mossadegh was taken out of power. He wasn't killed, by the way. He remained under house arrest until his death in the 1970s. But here's the kicker. It was British imperialism. So when you look today at the positives and the negatives, if you talk to Iranians, as we will describe about India in the next class session, Churchill is a villain. He overthrew, along with Eisenhower and Dulles, a democratically elected government. That is imperialism, my friends, at its worst. By the way, not bad, because we would have been better off if the Shah had remained in power, right? You're all imperialists if you think that. But let me point out to you that, again, if I were staging a debate on this stage, me versus myself, I could make a very strong case for the fact that the Iranian Revolution, which we are now experiencing, is really a result of what Britain did during the days of Churchill and the days of empire. But when we get to India in 2 weeks, remember there's no class next week, when we get to India, you'll really understand the nature of what Britain needed. All right, what I'd like to do, because I promised I'd give plenty of time for question and answers. So what I'd like to do now is to pause, take whatever questions you have. Please fire away. Yes. Question is about Churchill and his design of support for Zionism, which ipso facto, in the minds of some, meant the displacement of the Palestinians. All right. Have you ever heard of the term transfer? The idea that the British had, which was embraced not only by the British Conservative Party and by Churchill, it was embraced by the Labour Party. And if you go back and you take a look at the Labour Party platform in 1944, that is the year before Attlee takes power, they favored the transfer of the Arab population from Palestine to the uninhabited areas of the Arab Middle East. And by the way, population transfer was not an unusual concept. Actually, a Nobel Prize for Peace was given on the concept of transfer. So what we would today view as unconscionable was then viewed as legitimate. And let me give you the other example in terms of Israel. The transfer of approximately 600,000 Jews from Arab countries who were expelled from the Arab countries, and they were then absorbed into Israel. And the argument was made repeatedly was, why can't the Arabs do the same thing for their refugees? I mean, when you think about it from a logical point of view, it might make sense. I have a whole book in my library on the proposition of transfer in the Middle East, which, by the way, was not only supported by the British, Herbert Hoover supported it when he was president of the United States. So to respond directly to your question, the idea of transfer of populations, oh, wait, we're going to get to India next week, but okay, let me just anticipate. India is one country today, but do you remember what the other country was? Pakistan. Why was Pakistan carved off? For a population transfer. Wait, I'm not Jan Wall. So for me to cite movies is ridiculous. But if you look at Gandhi, the film Gandhi, you will see in the film Gandhi this transfer taking place of Muslims living in India, transferring to a new country called Pakistan, which ultimately divided into two. Does anybody remember what Pakistan's secession movement was called? What the country is? Bangladesh. Thank you. You get an A. Most people don't understand, and that's why, let me just quickly do this because I know there are many questions. What we view as imperialism today was not viewed as imperialism then. That nations, and when we talk about Churchill and Palestine and so forth in subsequent lectures, how do nations act generally? They act in their own self-interest, pure and simple. Does that make sense? Well, Churchill had a philosophy when it came to empire. What was good for empire, for Britain, was good for the world. If we benefited, you benefited. Which, by the way, if you stop and think about American imperialism, that was our philosophy. So what if we displaced Native Americans? You know, we're going to take the day off for indigenous peoples, what we used to call Columbus Day. God forbid you should call it Columbus Day today, because he was the ultimate representative of imperialism, right? So why am I throwing this into the 1920s? Because that is when Britain rises to its imperial apex in a way. It's not only in the Middle East, it's Asia too. Burma is a creation of Churchill. He created a country. This is what's so interesting. Now, what is really remarkable is if you were known as somebody who created a country, generally you were extolled for your virtues, weren't you? But not if you put it in the context of imperialism. So with all of Churchill's greatness, and when we do this in 2 weeks, we'll juxtapose his attitude toward Hitler in Germany to his attitude toward India. And that meant that his supporters and his opponents Both had gist for the mill, so to speak. Next question. Yes, sir. The question is, Churchill being relatively poor, I'm repeating it because this is being filmed for posterity. Churchill had a name, and his father had a name, and his mother came from money, but Churchill didn't have money. The bane of his existence was making a living. And even when he achieved greatness, so to speak, he still had to worry about money. Unlike the United States, where our politicians are basically for sale, and where you can come into Congress as a relatively poor person and end up with relatively a lot of money. Boy, that was my mistake. I should have run for Congress. But Churchill traded on his name and who he was. And one of the interesting stories is, he was in line to inherit Blenheim Palace. And the family was so thrilled because another heir came along and Churchill didn't get to take Blenheim Palace because he wasn't popular with the aristocracy. He wasn't popular with the elite. So I hope that answers the question. Next question. Yes, Julia. The question is about Mossadegh and the overthrow of the Shah and the overthrow of Mossadegh. That's why I mentioned Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was part of the CIA. His specialty was the Middle East. He created something in the 1950s that was funded by the CIA, which was purely designed to benefit that. And Kim Roosevelt actually wrote a series of books, including one on the Iranian Revolution. Interestingly enough, Kermit Roosevelt was an anti-Zionist. Why was he an anti-Zionist? Because he viewed the Arabs as a greater asset than the Jews, pure and simple. So when you're an imperialist and you're establishing empire, who do you rely on? You rely on the people who are your natural allies. Why did Churchill support Zionism? Two reasons. One, in his constituency, there was a large Jewish population, all of whom were Zionists. So for him, wanting to be reelected, it was a natural. Can you imagine an anti-Zionist being elected in New York to the United States Senate? How did Pat Moynihan get elected in 1976 in the primary? Because he'd spearheaded the fight against the Zionism as racism resolution. And Jews flocked to him because he was viewed. There's a book by Gil Troy, a good friend of mine, called Moynihan's Finest Hour. And it's really about that relationship. That was Churchill's sympathy to Zionism. But there was another sense. If you're an imperialist, you're looking for ways to preserve your empire, your imperialism. And Churchill believed, and I read it to you a moment ago in that speech, that the Jews supporting Britain during World War I would be a tipping point. He maintained in the end that it was Jewish influence that brought the United States into World War I. Of course, you know that isn't true. You know what brought the United States into World War I? Imperialism. You all know what it was? The Zimmermann telegram. It was Germany suggesting to Mexico that they go to war with the United States and seize former Mexican territory. That is what tipped Woodrow Wilson toward going to war. And go home and Google it, the Zimmermann telegram, and you'll see it's very clear, it's very precise. And by the way, just so you're aware, before Wilson decided to go to war, he had to have proof that the Zimmermann telegram was legitimate. He had to be provided an actual copy. And then when he decided to go to war in April of 1917, he did it on the basis of the fact that that was a real attack by Germany, potentially on the United States. And it made perfect sense, didn't it? If you were an imperialist and you wanted to enlist the Mexicans, what were the Mexicans most angry about? They lost their empire. And who stole it? The United States of America. So I'll make you a deal. You want your empire back? You declare war on the United States at the same time we're declaring war on them, and we got a two-front war. Isn't it fascinating? Somebody once asked me the question, why is geography important to history? You cannot understand history without it. Let me just give you one other example. I was asked about last night's 60 Minutes. And the first segment with Zelensky. And the second segment had to do with the current controversy in Israel. Do you understand what Putin's motivation is? It was the same thing that motivated Churchill and the British, that motivates America, to be secure. And if you have a buffer, and let's assume you're Russia for a minute, and going back to Churchill, going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, who attacked the Bolsheviks? The West attacked the Bolsheviks. So the concept was for subsequent leaders of the Soviet Union and then Russia, that if you had a buffer, meaning Eastern Europe, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, we'll get to the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, which is an absolutely fascinating moment in Churchill's history and the history of the West. That's Putin's logic. Somebody said to me, well, Putin's an imperialist. I said, if I were a Russian, I might be an imperialist too. Think how often they've been attacked by Germany. Think how often their soft underbelly has been revealed. So if you wanted to survive and you were Putin and you believe that the Soviet Empire protected you, you'd be in favor of it. And the same thing, ladies and gentlemen, applied to Churchill's concept of Britain and British Empire. You know what he said to Roosevelt? He said, I did not become the king's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. So you know what the British did? They substituted a word, Commonwealth. And they thought when they used that word that it would make a difference. No, it didn't. But Britain is still trying to repair that damage. Okay, I'm sorry. Next question. Yes. Yeah. Question is about the gold standard. Okay. I know you've all taken my course on defeated candidates for president of the United States. And you know that in 1896 in this country, the great battle was between William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of the Platte, who they used to say was like the River Platte, wide at the mouth and small at the source, and William McKinley. And it was a battle between gold and silver. When I teach that class, I bring in a small Bryan silver dollar. 16-1 was the proportion. But then I bring in what the Republicans produced, a giant 16-1. It's not silver, it's just pewter. But the point is, it showed the contrast in a graphic way. Churchill and many believed in the gold standard because the gold standard was adopted worldwide. Gold became the vehicle. Why do you think we have Fort Knox, for God's sake? And it still exists, although nobody talks about it. Do you remember when Steve Forbes ran for president? And he talked about restoring America to the gold standard. If you listened, funny, I heard a commercial this morning on KCBS. Now that I do commentary for KCBS, I can use them. KGO is no longer a factor. Who was on promoting it? Dr. Paul. Yes, the same Paul who was a member of Congress and who was Rand Paul's father. And what is he promoting? Invest in gold. It's your best bet. You can't go wrong. So the point is, Churchill believed in the 1920s, and remember, for the West in the 1920s, imperialism, it meant you had access to gold. By the way, you had access to diamonds because of South Africa. You had a tremendous amount of resources being used. But the idea was to get a monopoly on gold because the world operated on the gold standard. Now, the greatest investment mistake I ever made, do you remember when gold was $35 an ounce? And you could buy gold for $35 an ounce. Did anybody here buy a lot of gold? No, of course not. Because nobody could imagine what would happen with gold. Churchill believed very strongly that gold was a stable commodity, which would always be useful in ensuring the economy of the West. And that is the reason that he advocated going to the gold standard. By the way, going back, if I can, for a moment to oil. Why do you think oil, in a sense, replaced gold? Black gold. Remember when it was called black gold? You remember that? Why? Because you couldn't lubricate an economy with gold, but you could lubricate an economy with oil. So when you presided over empire, when you were trying to build an empire, you built it based on the commodity that you thought was the future. And that is the logic of empire. Pure and simple. So that answers the question, I hope. I think Churchill came to realize his error ultimately. But if I had asked you, well, I was curious. None of us are old enough really to remember when we went off the gold standard, but how many people in your family kept gold pieces? $20 gold pieces, sure. When they were told to turn them all in, people kept them because there was always that doubt. And how many times do I see, I had a very good friend whose mother had a gold giant $20 gold piece around her neck, which she no longer wore in later years because people were pulling, so, but we all learn our lessons. And so that is the thing. Always remember, gold was Churchill's vehicle, but ultimately the British decided it was black gold. And that's why British petroleum became so critical in the maintenance of the British Empire. Next question. Yes. Correct. The overthrow of the, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's be clear, and your point is excellent. And it, by the way, we can make it fit because Churchill was no longer prime minister in 1956. You all remember, and your point is extremely well taken, that Britain and France both resented the fact that they were no longer world powers. How do you reestablish yourself as a world power? The Suez Canal, which was built by British and French money and industry. And Nasser comes along in 1956 and nationalizes the Suez Canal and essentially says to the British and the French, you're out of here. It's over. Now, the British and the French did not want to lose empire. And so they made a deal with the Israelis. The Israelis were terrified of Nasser of Egypt. And Nasser of Egypt repeatedly said, I'm going to drive the Jews into the sea. I'm going to destroy them. So the British and the French came up with a brilliant idea. Why don't we allow the Israelis to attack Egypt? The Israelis will win, which they did. And then the world will want us to go back in and seize the Suez Canal and keep it open. And we will once again control everything. Now, it made perfect sense. Except Dwight D. Eisenhower said no. One of the reasons Eisenhower said no is because the British and the French didn't tell Eisenhower in advance. It was not a conspiracy, if you will, that included the United States. But Eisenhower, whatever people think about Eisenhower, I have to tell you, he was a brilliant strategist. Eisenhower understood that the age of imperialism was over. He understood very clearly that you could not control. By the way, that's the reason he didn't want to go into Southeast Asia. When at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French wanted the United States to interfere, Eisenhower said absolutely not. Because he understood the limitations. Now, that was a classic case of imperialism trying to resurrect itself. I try to stick to Churchill, but it's important. That's what Putin is doing. Do you understand? Putin is taking classic, not Soviet imperialism, but Russian imperialism, because whether Russia was ruled by Tsar or Commissar or Yeltsin or Putin, it didn't matter. They understood where their imperial interests lay. And it's the idea of recreating empire. Well, I've got news for you. You can't go backward, can you? You can't go backward. And that was part of the problem. Yes. Yes. A transfer worked with India and Pakistan to a degree because the Muslims moved, and also the Turks and the Armenians and the whole question of that area. So, you know, transfer is an interesting concept. Is it an imperialist concept? It's a very good question. For instance, there were many in Israel who said, based on what happened with Churchill in 1922, that there was a Palestinian state. Jordan was located on 80% of the land area of Palestine, and about 80% of the population of Jordan were Palestinians. So, wasn't Jordan Palestine? Now, it's an interesting question. Why did that not come into being? For two reasons. First, because the Hashemite family would not surrender control of their kingdom. Made perfect sense. And number two, because in the end, the Israelis understood they could make a deal with Jordan, which ultimately evolves into a peace treaty, but they could not make a deal with the Palestinian leadership led by Haj Amin al-Husseini and Ahmed Shukeri and Yasser Arafat. So why are these classes, to me, are so intriguing, and these kinds of questions, which I really have tried to get into. I was the chairman of the Jordan is Palestine Committee, and I had long discussions with Palestinians and with Jordanians, and ultimately realized it didn't matter what the facts were. It's not what is. I had an old professor in college, Harry Nerhood, and he said, if you want to pass this class, remember this quote. So if you want to pass this class, remember this quote. It's not what is that really counts. It's what man thinks is. It's not what is that really counts. It's what man thinks is. And why do I say that? Because I can make a case today that Jordan is Palestine. But it doesn't matter because it isn't accepted, even if you have all the factual data that you need. And so that's a serious issue when you deal with imperialism. Part of the imperialist principle is that you create your own reality. And I understand that. That's what Britain did. If you think about Winston Churchill, and I have a whole book just dealing with Churchill's view of imperialism, Churchill believed that the British control of these areas was beneficial for the people who lived there, the indigenous people, but also good for the world. And he believed it with perfect faith. And when we get to the 1930s, and you understand Hitler's logic in Sudeten Germany and Austria, it makes perfect sense when an imperialism clashes with the West? Yes. Yeah. Okay, this is great. It's a great question. First of all, when you listen to the Murrow recording, you will hear Churchill speak French. Now, I took 4 years of French. I'm not fluent in French, but I understand pretty much what's happening. I couldn't understand a word of it. There were imperial powers in the 1930s, 1920s, and the teens. So with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the imperialists divide the Middle East. It's very simple. Great Britain got what was known as Palestine and Iraq. Actually, Palestine was southern Syria. But the French wanted Syria. So when the mandates were handed out, the British got Palestine and they got Iraq. The French got Syria, and that was their stronghold. And another country which didn't exist, Lebanon, which is carved out of nothing to become a country. Why? Talked about population transfer. There were Christians in Lebanon, Maronite Christians. Do you think the Maronite Christians trusted that their security would be ensured by Muslims? So it was very simple. You carved out another country, Lebanon, which, by the way, until the 1970s, had a 70% Christian population. Today, it's flipped. 80% of Lebanon is now Muslim, simply on birth rate. And the Maronites were decimated. The Maronites were aligned with the French. So essentially what you had with the end of the First World War and the carving up of the Ottoman Empire, if I were teaching my course on the Middle East, I would have gone into greater depth. What you had was imperial powers defining boundaries in the Middle East and creating countries. Iraq is created, Lebanon is created, Jordan is created, Israel is created. The only thing they couldn't carve up was Egypt. But who controlled Egypt? Great Britain. Why? Because of the Suez Canal. And now we take for granted shipping lanes. But do you understand? The person who controlled the Suez Canal controlled East and West. And those were the trade routes. So when somebody asked me the question about gold, it's intriguing because what was the real gold? The gold ultimately became trade. And what sits as a bridge between three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe? The Middle East. That's it. So if you're an imperialist, you better know your geography. So I hope that answers a question. If this were my course on the Middle East, I would go into great depth about how these maps were drawn. And there was great resentment. Let me just give you an example. When the Balfour Declaration was issued, what did it include? It included all of Israel, all of the West Bank, what is known as the West Bank, and all of Jordan. And I want to repeat this. How did Churchill define the borders? Take a look at a map. He drew a line along the Jordan River and created a country called Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan. He installs his own leadership there. And in 1946, remember, Churchill is no longer prime minister. He loses the election of 45. We'll get to that 3 or 4 or 5 lectures down the road. It becomes an independent kingdom. And do you know what the formal name of Jordan is? The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It's named after a family. Wait, who put the family there? Not the indigenous population, ladies and gentlemen. Winston Simpson Spencer Churchill is the true father. And so when you talk about the Middle East and all of its complexities, it's very clear. And the French played a critical role in all of that. And by the way, they faced rebellion. I will never forget this. In the 1950s, there was still French Empire. What countries did France control? Algeria and Morocco. They controlled these countries. And there was a civil war. I know this vividly because my brother-in-law, the late Leo Abrami, was a French citizen who fled to Switzerland so he would not have to serve in the French army during the war in Algeria. And I can remember as a kid, my sister and brother-in-law got married in 1959. And I can remember his explaining to me, I'm 10 years old, I said, explain to me, how did you, a Frenchman, end up in Switzerland? And he said, I didn't want to serve in the French army. So the ramifications of imperialism, British and French, actually, it'd be fascinating one day to just teach a class on imperialism. But anyway, okay, was there one more question? Because I see that I'm almost, well, I've got two more. I'll be quick. You don't mind staying a little late. Go ahead. Can I differentiate genocide from transfer? The answer is yes. Genocide is what Germany did to the Jews. They built camps for the purpose of killing people. You know what the Germans did? There were troop trains going to the front. They stopped the troop trains to get the Jews to Auschwitz and other camps because the philosophy was you've got to kill them all. So that's the difference. Last question. Yes. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was put together. It was an attempt, again, by imperialists, by the French and the British, to carve up the Middle East. And Sykes-Picot fell by the wayside because once the Ottoman Empire was teetering and tottering, everyone wanted to reassess what they should do and how they should do it. Picot was the French, Sykes was the British, and it faded in history. But you understand, when you announce these kinds of plans, in that period of time, it was not objectionable. Are you listening? It was viewed as routine because superpowers were expected to be imperialists. Now, I want you to understand one other thing. America was never an imperialist power. Oh, wait, I'm not right. Why? We did take colonies, if you will, in the Pacific, but they didn't benefit us the way colonies would normally benefit us. Our imperialism was economic imperialism. Domination of certain industries, which we still control. I mean, you have to stop and think about the arms industry. Who is the primary arms supplier in the world? Good, bad, or indifferent? It's the United States of America. And nations rely to this day on American weaponry. What do you think is going on in Ukraine right now? We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Now, the question you're asking is, what do we get out of it? If we have a stable Balkans, it's worth the investment. But if everything falls apart, another war on the Balkans, a broader war, and Zelensky talked about it last night. He said, if we lose, the Russians will be on the border with Poland, and then you will have a third world war. If you haven't heard the interview with Zelensky, it's well worth listening. All right. I know there are more questions, but we can't. I will be back in 2 weeks, and we will have, we'll talk about the 1930s. All right. Have a good one.